Good evening, everyone. My name is Quisha Mallette. I'm a staff attorney with the North Carolina Justice Center with our Fair Chance Criminal Justice Project. I'm really excited to invite you to be a part of this event where we will be doing a bit of a deep dive into the way that American Rescue Plan Act dollars can be used to fund reentry efforts. I know that a lot of folks joining this evening are already engaged in reentry work and or directly impacted by issues relating to reentry. And so we're really excited to share this information with you and also hear from you about your own insights in your local areas. So I will introduce our panelists. I'm so excited to have folks joining us from around the state. And just in order of where I'm seeing folks on the screen, we'll start with Suzy Khachaturyan from the North Carolina Budget and Tax Center, and Felicia Arriaga from North Carolina NC SPAN. We also have Daquan Peters, who is a community activist in Wilmington and also representing For Justice, and Drew Dahl with the Religious Coalition for Nonviolent Durham. And we also have Tim Young, who is our communications specialist here for our Fair Chance Criminal Justice team. And he will be, you will see his face a couple of times as we go through this event. So just want to talk a little bit, provide a very brief overview of what is going on with the American Rescue Plan Act and a little bit of what we may be able to think about when it comes to reentry funding. So the American Rescue Plan Act, it was signed into law March 11th, 2021. One part of it was allocating $350 billion for state and local governments in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that in North Carolina, in terms of the local funding that's come through and is coming through, North Carolina localities, including counties and cities and other local areas, are receiving the funds, the rescue plan dollars, that they'll get in two batches. They've received one half of their funds and the other half should be coming in May. And there's some additional details that I think Suzy will be able to provide for you around the focus of the American Rescue Plan Act, but just want to mention that one of the areas that we see really, really closely connecting to the capacity for reentry funding is around the impacts on public health, and particularly thinking about the social determinants of health. And so when you think about the Rescue Plan Act dollars being intended to support communities that are hardest hit and have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, then we definitely know that our folks who are returning home from incarceration, folks who have been home and are living with the really harsh consequences of having a record are certainly those who are hardest hit and those that we want to make sure have access to the resources that can be made available through these funds. Just want to emphasize that we are talking about millions of dollars that are coming locally, and some things that people have said about it is, include that this is some of the most money that we've seen since the New Deal. And I kind of like to call it a new Deal. And we want to make sure that this new Deal also includes funds for folks who have been directly impacted by the carceral system. So we have you here tonight to make sure that you know what's going on with this money. You can hear some great ideas about ways that the money might be used. You'll be able to hear the importance of using this money towards reentry, and then also some efforts that have been happening in different local areas that are relevant to reentry and otherwise relevant to equitable use of the American Rescue Plan Act dollars. Just a little bit for the kind of logistics for the call. There is a live transcript that's available. If you look at the bottom black panel on the webinar, you can click CC live transcript and you'll be able to catch that. If you have any questions, you can feel free to click the Q&A and you can ask questions directly of the panelists and hosts, and we will answer them to the extent that we are able to, either in writing or raise them during the conversation. And then finally, you are welcome to access the chat. We definitely want to get feedback from you in some way. So let us know kind of what you're thinking about as we move through the conversation. You're also welcome to use the chat however may be useful to you as we move through this process. We may also be sharing links with you in the chat for additional resources that may be useful to you. So before we dive into the details of this funding opportunity, this new deal, then I would like to pass things over to Tim Young, our communication specialist, to run a poll for the group.
All right, so it's gonna be a very simple poll for you. I'm just gonna ask you, we're just asking about your familiarity with the Rescue Plan Act. So it should pop up on your screen right now. Simply ask what your familiarity with the ARPA is so we might be able to gauge our discussion as we go. All right, so right out the gate, it looks like we are about maybe 50-50 between somewhat familiar to not familiar. All right, yeah, so total looks like we're about somewhat familiar, seems to be the majority of our participants today.
Okay, great. And if you're able to show the poll results, that's great too. And in response to the chat, we are going to have the recording available on Facebook, and we will send follow-up email with survey and links to the resources that we're sharing today. Okay. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Tim, for this. And you'll be getting another poll later on in the conversation. But without further ado, I would like to pass it over to Daquan Peters to do a little bit of framing of the issue and talk to us about why we need funds to support reentry opportunities in the first place.
Thank you, Quisha. How's everybody? Thank you for allowing me to join. I'm glad you touched on, you said something about communities, the American Rescue Plan being something for communities that's most hard hit. As we all know, someone coming and returning back from incarceration into society, that individual is already 10 steps behind someone that's already out here that's never been incarcerated. So they would be pretty much below or in a worse situation than the hardest hit communities that we see going on around now, dealing with what we're dealing with in today's time. So the importance of money being funded to returning citizens, and I don't really want to use citizen because if we're going to use community, we might as well use citizen. We're part of an undercast system, and that's just simple as that. And when we say community and citizens, that creates a whole nother dialogue. But for the sake of this conversation, I would say that someone who's returning back to society, take someone who's been gone 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, that individual has been separated from society and they have to play catch up automatically. Now, when that individual comes and he proven himself, his or herself to be someone who's really trying to get themselves on the right track, there are not things that are available for them that they really think that are available for them, such as resources for reentry. So when you're dealing with reentry, there's a number of things that we have to understand the concept of, which is mental health, employment, job skills, skill development, education, social networking, because people have been confined in certain spaces for a certain period of time. That their networking skills, their social abilities are limited. They're pretty much socially handicapped. And getting back to adjustment of that is already hard. But to do that as an individual who's broke and fighting from the back is going to be hard. So a few things that can be done with this money and to show the importance of it, and just the key thing, why the importance of funding for returning people coming from incarceration is to decrease the recidivism rate. That's what the whole purpose of the funding and the importance of funding would be, to decrease the recidivism rate. So for instance, for example, say if you had a entrepreneurship program and a set of funds set aside for people coming home from incarceration that has foolproof plans, business plans, that want to be able to be there, be self-sufficient and be able to take care of their family. A person that's coming home from incarceration that's been going over 7 years pretty much don't have no credit. So when that individual is coming back to society, they don't have credit, they don't have funds, they don't have anything. So then another thing, and I'm always say about recidivism, because you're automatically dealing with people that has a mindset of don't have a problem with breaking the law to get what they want. I was one of those people, because I know I've been to prison 4 times. I've served over 20 years of my life in prison and during incarceration, 25 actually. So I already know that mindset coming home. A lot of people don't want to come home and hear no. So if it's certain things that's set in place for that individual to be able to elevate and to be able to become more productive, as well as be able to create opportunities and jobs for other people with this funding. If you take an individual that has a foolproof plan, and his plan that he has can create other jobs and opportunities for other people that's coming out of incarceration, because jobs are limited to them, good quality jobs are limited to them. So you give them the opportunity to create their own jobs. That's one thing that you could do with funding and to decrease the recidivism rate. That's one thing. Another thing, people are coming home from prison that's beat down with debt. When they enter into society, they're already in debt because they owe the system some form of restitution, fines, fees. They might have to pay certain things to get their license back. They have probation fees. They have all of these things. And a lot of times us as advocates and out here on boots on the ground, we see it where it's hard to get people to respect somebody that's coming pro se. What I mean pro se is meaning honoring and representing themselves in front of a courtroom, versus them having an attorney. So what I can say, that can be a set of these funds could be set aside for certain nonprofit organizations that are dealing with reentry organizations, all of these local reentry councils that they have scattered out across North Carolina. They should have one specific attorney on retainer to be able to represent these people to the fullest ability of their practice, and understand that these people need a second chance. That's one thing that can be done with a set of funds. For each county that has a local reentry council should have an attorney on staff at that local reentry council, fully funded by the county, because a lot of these counties are getting this money. Then when you come to housing, a lot of these politicians and local leaders and local officials are realtors, or even some form of fashion into the real estate business. Either their friends have developments. You can set a set of funds together for people that's coming home to be able to either waive, to be able to pay some of the application fees. It's all kind of creative ways to be able to do things with this money, to be able to assist people and support them in a second chance. It just has to be completely, transparent about what you're really trying to do with this money, and showing and proving through a person, not just their words, but their ways and actions. So you'll take a person like me, who's just served 12 and a half years in the federal prison, and coming home, I was dropped off out here into society because I had a release date of 2026. And because of the First Step Act, I was released back out here into society, just dropped off back out here, just picked up and just threw out here with no kind of plans in place for me. So I had to be the individual to go to a lot of these places, and it wasn't a lot of things that was there. So I had to be able to go and pay for my driver's license. I had to pay for all of these things out of my pocket, on top of being able to have to find somewhere to live and stay, and transportation and all of these things. if you have funds set aside for this and the funds are actually being utilized for this, and don't put a bunch of red tape and criterias around how people are going to receive this money for them to be able to get a second chance, then, what are we doing? That's just simple as that, because funding is needed, simple as that, for individuals coming out of incarceration and into society. That is very important. If you can charge us, if we have to pay all of these fines and fees for you to incarcerate us, then we should receive something in return once we paid our debt to society. To me, a lot of people say the system is all about money, and we know it's about money, but the system also utilizes time as a weapon and a tool, because they know that's our most valuable resource. That's something we can't get back. We can't get the time back that you took from us. So the least thing you could do is provide these resources for us coming back into society that's going to continue us to be great in who we really is, to help us tap into ourselves. Another thing that could be utilized with this money is provide mentorship programs for individuals that's coming home from incarceration, providing psychological support to people coming in and out of incarceration, because it's a traumatizing experience in itself. I don't care if you serve one day. I don't care if you serve hours. The clinking and clacking and keys and slamming the bars and all of those things does something to some people. So, if you can make it more easier for a person adjusting to that, it's going to take funding. So you can take a person right now with an addiction, and if that person doesn't have certain type of insurance, then they can't get the treatment that a person really, that individual needs. So that's going to lead that individual to go right back to committing crimes. I had an individual to tell me the other day that he begged the judge for help. He's been in prison 7 times. Prison doesn't cure his disease, but because of his insurance, he can't get the help that he needs. So that's another area that the funding has to be in. That's a health issue. So the health department has to be brought into it. All of these individuals and these entities within these counties has a very, very important role to play when assisting and supporting somebody with second chances. I don't care what element of the government they're in, even down to social services. So a person with certain drug offenses can't get food stamps. So if I can't get food stamps and I'm going to work, and you taking my taxes out of my money, and I still can't get food stamps, and part of this money that you're taking from my taxes goes back to food stamps, goes back to part of being able to give people food stamps. So I'm paying to give people food stamps that I can't get. So now I have to go to work and bust my butt to be able to put food in my refrigerator and put gas in my car at the high cost and value that's going on today. So there's no support for an individual who's been working and fell on hard times, that has criminal background, to go to somebody and say, hey, I need support with paying gas, I need $100 to pay for my gas to get back and forth to work for the past week, or $50. There's no program for that. There's no such thing as that. Yeah, they'll tell you they give you a bus ticket, but that's only going to last for so long. So transportation, funding for transportation for things like that, gas cards, can be something that an individual can have at the local reentry councils instead of just bus tickets. All of these things. I don't want to take up too much of y'all time. I appreciate y'all allowing me to share. It's many, many aspects of this system and a part of reentry that this funding can go to. And the very, very, very important aspect of it is to stop recidivism and give a person a second chance.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments, Daquan. I mean, always on time. And seeing a comment from the chat, Sarah Jessica Farber saying, preach, we need to expand Medicare too. And from Felicia, thank you, Daquan. Thank you again for your time. And I hope, this is a reminder to us of how this is an issue that affects all of us. And many of us have opportunity to kind of put down our concerns around what happens to folks in our community. But if we do want to see our communities as a whole be well, and we want to see our communities be whole, then we will believe in pushing forward opportunities such as having access to these funds for folks across our state. So I'm going to hand it over to Suzy Khachaturyan to talk us through a little bit more of the ARPA process, how funds are distributed locally, who makes decisions, and other important information that Suzy can share. And before I do, just want to also uplift another comment from Anthony Faison. Thank you, Daquan, for keeping it 100. So thank you.
Thank you, Quisha. And it's an honor to be on this amazing panel. I'm excited to talk a little bit more about the American Rescue Plan. While I try to share my screen, I just dropped a couple of links in the chat that I'll just resources that I will generally be referencing. So I think you all can see my screen. Quisha, do you mind giving me a thumbs up if you can see? Okay, cool. Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to give, as Quisha said, an overview of the American Rescue Plan. And first want to just start with sort of putting into context where the American Rescue Plan sort of fits into the federal COVID relief picture more broadly. So we see it as really the sixth piece of federal COVID legislation. As Quisha said at the outset, it was signed into law on March 11th last year. So we celebrated the 1-year anniversary a couple of years ago. But as you know, the reason that we're all here is that there's still plenty more work to do. And so thinking more specifically about the funds that I'm going to be talking about. So this slide just sort of represents the different issue area buckets that were included in the American Rescue Plan. And so these funds are specific to North Carolina, but as I said, each of these lines are really buckets of individual funding streams. And so what I want to focus on today is what you see here in yellow. These are called the state and local fiscal recovery funds. And so collectively, there's $8.9 billion in fiscal recovery funds coming to North Carolina. And so when we kind of break that down into who's getting what, I really like this graphic from the North Carolina Pandemic Recovery Office that sort of highlights the 4 different levels of government that are receiving funds. So on the top left-hand side, you see the $5.4 billion approximately that the state of North Carolina received. There's $668 million, see on the bottom left, going to the 26 largest municipalities, about $2 billion going to, with some funds going to each of the 100 counties in North Carolina. And then the remaining $705 million going to more than 500 small local governments. So these are like cities and towns. The technical name is their non-entitlement units. So this is where all of the $8.9 billion are going. And so every single local government in North Carolina is receiving funds. And as Daquan and Quisha have already said, there's incredible opportunity. This is really, really a transformational moment in all of the United States, because this is the picture for North Carolina, but there's similar scope of funds going to every locality in the United States, including tribal governments. So on the left-hand side, you can see the 4 big buckets of eligible uses. So funds can be used to replace revenue that was lost. They can be used to support the public health and economic response, provide premium pay, and for investments in infrastructure, and specifically just 3 areas of infrastructure. And these are water, sewer, and broadband. Just to kind of narrow in on specific local governments, this is obviously just a very small subset of cities and counties that I honestly randomly chose, but I just wanted to offer a sense of like just how much money we're talking about, because I know the 8.9 billion is it's a large number, and it's hard to know how that actually translates into cities and counties. So obviously a lot of these are large local governments. Mecklenburg is getting 216 million total. City of Charlotte, 141 million, but also, you know, smaller local governments like Beaufort County getting 9 million. So again, this is just a very small sample of the more than 600 local governments in North Carolina, but hopefully this gives you a sense of just how much money we're talking about. And for a lot of these local governments, you know, this is like 20 to 25%, if not more, of their local budget amount. And so it's really substantial money that they can use for a broad range of purposes. So thinking about timeline, the dates on this slide are the dates from the US Treasury. And so you'll see in this red box here on the bottom right, this is the timeline that we're looking at moving forward. And Quisha mentioned that half of the funds have already been distributed, and then the remaining half of the funds are coming this summer as early as May. And so these funds need to be spent, or the decisions about how to spend these funds need to be made by December 31st, 2024. And then the money needs to actually be spent, like out of the bank accounts, money is spent. That needs to be done by December 31st, 2026. And so we see this work as multi-year work because you know, we'll be doing this work collectively, all of us on this call, through 2026. And so now is a really important time to get involved and to really see how you can engage in your local community efforts. So I just wanted to up a couple of examples. So while all of this is a really important opportunity, there's transformational possibilities, it's also never really been done before on this scale. And so on the one hand, that's an opportunity. And on the other hand, it's a real challenge because there's so much money, there's so many possibilities. And so I would urge you all to really try and get a handle on what's happening in your local government if you aren't already engaged, because what I'll talk a little bit more about is that, and I think Felicia will talk even more about this, but we need to be make the priorities of the community clear to people. So I mentioned that there's more than 600 local governments receiving funds. There are also more than 600 processes happening. And so the major monumental challenge that we have is to try and understand where different local governments are, how they're actually creating a process, whether that process is public, whether that process, as it's been conceptualized, includes any public input. And so really trying to get a handle on what's going on is really, really important. On this slide are some clips from different websites, from different local governments, just to show the different range of processes and approaches. So some local governments you'll see, like in Fayetteville, they created a plan pretty early on and invited nonprofit applications. City of Henderson is doing something similar. New Hanover County hit the ground running pretty early on and has already made a lot of their decisions. And then you can see on the top right is an image from a survey that was done in Durham. So these are some ways that communities are engaging with the local community. but this really just kind of skims the surface. So I just wanted to mention what's possible. Some of the things that you should know as you're thinking about this work is per the federal guidance that came from the US Department of Treasury, these are all the things that local governments should be doing. They should be engaging with residents to prioritize spending. They should be considering how these dollars can support the most vulnerable and disproportionately impacted members of the community. They should be, thinking about transformative change, strategic investments. They should be transparent. Residents should be able to understand what's happening, which is all great, but it doesn't actually tell local governments how to do this. And so a lot of them are, to be totally honest, still trying to understand how these funds can even be used, how they need to meet federal guidance so that they're in compliance with the law. And so there's, again, it's like tremendous opportunity, but there's also tremendous challenge that we're seeing. Some other key approaches that I wanted to lift up were, again, this is referencing what's in the federal guidance, the need to prioritize those hardest hits, emphasizing reaching those who have been left out so far. There are no federal requirements that grantees ask about immigration status. And that's true of not only the local governments receiving funds, but also say nonprofit organizations that may receive a grant from the dollars that local governments receive. And they're also, again, this is sort of repeating what was on the last slide, but the need to engage constituents and communities in creating these plans. And so we're seeing this in some places and we're not seeing this in other places. So some of the key ways that you can engage, what's misleading about this slide is that it makes it seem like a linear process, and it certainly is not, in part because the funds are coming in two different halves, but also what we're seeing has been an iterative process where places like in Mecklenburg County, they've decided to allocate some portion of funds. And so there was a process where they released like an RFP for nonprofits to be able to submit applications. And then once that process has closed, they're now thinking, okay, what can we do later on this year? But so it's a little bit unclear what the general timeline is, but I just want to point out this slide makes it seem very nice and simple. Just follow the list, but it's not in reality. So one place to start is to figure out the current status of the fiscal recovery funds, what decisions have been made, what decisions remain to be made, and when are those decisions going to be made? How are those decisions going to be made? How are they involving the community in assessing needs? How will funds be decided? How will the needs be assessed? Is there a survey? Who knows about the survey? How are you actually getting the survey into people's hands? Again, sort of engaging the community. How can the community get involved? Do they know how to get involved? Thinking about policy design, because it's not just about, the hurdle of getting funds directed somewhere is a substantial one, but also how is the program being designed, because that can also leave people out. And then thinking about the timeline for decisions. Has it been established? Are there milestones within that time frame? How are they thinking about using their general fund budget in addition to this federal relief? And then thinking about implementing the decisions and understanding how progress will be tracked. So I know that was a whirlwind. It was all very general, but I did, here's my email address. I'm happy to answer questions here, but also folks can always reach out to me and I can try to provide some individual assistance as well. So Quisha, I'll pass it back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Suzy. And there's so much activity in the chat. Want to pause a little bit before we continue. First, someone well, not quite in order, but someone had asked earlier about what SLFRF stands for. And Tim shared it's the state and local fiscal recovery funds.
Yes, I apologize. I couldn't see the chat.
Yeah, no worries. And then also, so I think some of this will probably come up with what Felicia shares as well, but they're just kind of some general questions about, like, if you don't mind just going back over, like, who is controlling these funds? Who is determining what happens with them, and what might be some ways that folks can like learn more about that process locally? And we know that that's going to take some, you know, kind of local digging. But just if you could just provide us just one more quick overview of, like, all right, what is happening with all this money? There's so much information. What are the highlights we need to hold on?
Absolutely, yes. All really important questions. So at the city level, city councils make decisions about where funds are spent. At the county level, and I'm also happy to like write this up if it's easier to see this information visually. So at the city level, it's city council, and at the county level, it's county commissioners. Now, at both of those levels, there are, you know, sometimes one staffer that's part-time, sometimes a whole group of staffers that you know, kind of work behind the scenes. They might be the ones, you know, doing the day-to-day work. They do the day-to-day work and thinking about, you know, making updates to the website, posting things to Facebook to reach community members. And so they're really in charge of working with the county commissioners and city council to accomplish the work that the council and the commissioners decide are important. So county managers and city managers are also really important people to reach out to if you have questions. Quisha, there might have been more that I didn't mention, so please remind me if I missed something.
Yeah, I think those are kind of the major ones, and just because I'm really trusting Felicia may kind of hit some of these other points, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you. Thank you so much, Suzy, for what you've done to digest this information and share it with the group. And so right now, handing it over to Felicia Arriaga, just to kind of maybe stir us up a little, and also just help us think a little bit about, you know, how do we want to move with these funds locally, and what that might mean, what that might actually look like. So handing it over to you.
Thanks, y'all. And I actually am gonna repeat and lift up what Daquan is saying in the chat, who I hope comes back on and we can have a conversation about too, that the folks who are sort of making the decisions about these funds are always the hardest hit, and who potentially aren't going to actually have access to making the decisions, right? And so I think in the chat, a lot of this is great conversation, because I do think it's like pretty, like, we don't know, right, where this information is right now. And so Suzy and I have been emailing a little bit this week about, like, do we have an internal tracker, right, to be able to say, in this city, you go to this website, you'll be able to do it. Because it does feel like there isn't a statewide strategy, sort of like by any government officials to effectively do this. And I see folks in the chat also saying that I was just at this meeting where it seemed like the county commissioners were learning about the money and all of these pieces. And so we just have a lot of these things that are not necessarily, we don't see them engaging in community, right? And I think that that's really important for us to also think about, like, what do these like surveys look like? I know Suzy mentioned a few places, and I also am just going to share my screen and show a little bit too, but also to like, to Quisha's point, is really thinking about, like, how do we keep pushing them and pressuring them to actually make this information more accessible to us, right? So some of the work that we do at NC-SPAN is around budget advocacy. So we do this on a regular basis, on a year-round basis. And so some of these funds are great to know, right, that there's this extra money coming in, a lot of it in sort of large amounts. And thinking about sort of like, what's the long-term strategy for us to keep on putting pressure on our local officials to make sure that they're telling us where this money is going, right? And also for us to be able to dictate where it's going, right? Where we want to see sort of community investments. And so we often take a divest invest approach to some of this, right? So we mostly sort of are interested in thinking about how do we reallocate the funds for law enforcement, from prisons, from the carceral state, and be able to put that into community programs that we know that are much more efficient and much more like able to actually support folks before they even enter into the carceral state, right? So I also just like want to emphasize that like that's important for us to say, is that if we don't actually have the ability to say, hey, this is where we want the funds to go, we're going to see that money go into fill budget gaps, right? And so we're going to see that also happening, like some of that overtime pay we've seen from the federal government, some of that being pressured to be used for law enforcement. And that's also not what we want, right? We want that money to be going to our community members, but if we don't have a process and we don't have a say in how that's going to happen, then it is going to be able to go to some of those government services that we may not actually think work on a regular basis, right? So some of the things that I've also seen and that I really appreciate a sort of Suzy lifting up is like thinking about sort of what's possible. And sorry, I'm going to stop sharing this screen because those are my files, but I will share my other screen if I can get on the right screen to just be able to share some of the what the sort of like websites look like that are happening. And I think part of this is like an opportunity to advocate for our local communities to actually be doing this, not just for this particular type of funding, but to be doing this on a regular basis, right? So if you all have looked at any of your city and county budgets, most of the time, they're only gonna be in English, right? If there's any sort of process, they're gonna be in English. Wake County, somehow, I don't know how, but everyone learned how to make a survey real quick during some of this ARP money coming in. And I think we can actually like push them to keep on doing that, right? To make sure that there's some of this conversation happening on a regular basis. And at least in Wake County, they also have this survey available in multiple language, right? There isn't right now across the board in North Carolina that I can think of, and Suzy can maybe sort of correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think any of our normal sort of like every year, whenever we adopt our city and county budgets, none of these are actually available in any other language besides English, right? And so if this is an opportunity where sort of local government is saying, actually, we want to get input from folks on a regular basis in different languages, we actually can say to them, y'all can do this because you've done it in this process with the ARP funds, right? So this is just an example of this. I think to Suzy's point, they're getting all this information from community members, right, about where the priorities are. And I'm actually not sure, right, if they're actually going to then say, oh, well, 80% of the folks said they need more housing, they're going to allocate 80% to housing, right? I don't think it's that clear what they're going to do. And so it's really important for us to make sure that we're like holding them accountable and really sort of asking these questions of like, well, actually, what are the numbers look like? What did people request? And how is that money going into that? Greensboro has also an interesting sort of platform that they've been using where you can actually click around and sort of put in your own sort of recommendations on how spending is made. My understanding is that like this was initially part of sort of the Greensboro budgeting process at one point, but then was taken away, right? So there's different ways that we see local governments are able to actually connect with community members in a different way, even though, as Daquan pointed out before, it's not like they have canvassers out on the street in different neighborhoods also asking what folks want, right? Like I think that that's always going to be up to us as sort of community members, as community organizers to be doing that sort of like deep level part. And also I will shout out sort of Hendersonville because that's where I'm from Western North Carolina. So they also sort of have a similar one, and they have a whole video explaining what this is in Spanish, right? And so shout out to my friend Nancy for pulling this together. But this is also what it takes, right? Is if you want sort of this kind of input, you also have to be thinking about what it actually means to be getting some of that kind of input from local community members too. And so I think all of those things are important. I want to just reiterate too that what Suzy was saying as far as like what's possible. I think one piece that is really important to some of the folks that I work with around sort of immigrant rights is that these funds aren't necessarily like there isn't sort of requirements around their legal status, right? And so where we've seen in other states as well, which we haven't necessarily taken that jump here, is states have actually set aside money for called excluded worker funds, right? Meaning that that money is open to folks who maybe weren't able to access stimulus checks, right? And so I think that that's a huge piece that we haven't necessarily been explicit in this state of thinking about how do we create a whole fund that actually can get to those folks who weren't able to access stimulus checks, whether that's because people weren't necessarily advocating with folks who are incarcerated, right, to be able to actually fill out that paperwork, or folks who are also undocumented, right? So I think that there's some of those pieces too that we have, like, there's just so much we can do with these funds. And I think reentry is such an important piece of this conversation too. And I know that Anthony Faison is in the chat writing some stuff too. And I think we've been working and just really trying to dig into how much is even being allocated to reentry councils on a regular basis, right? Most of y'all on this call hopefully know that it's not much, right? And so to be then spreading that around to multiple organizations through the Reentry Council means that, like, the organizations that need to get funded are not getting funding, right? And so we have plenty of examples. I'm going to drop a resource in the chat from the Vera Institute of Justice, who has been sort of tracking where some of this recovery has gone to more sort of alternatives to law enforcement. And so we have some examples like in DC, where there's been a lot of money from the ARP funds that have been actually specifically allocated for reentry programs to provide more assistance to those leaving jails, to be able to create these things called ready centers, where people who are leaving jail can actually go there to try to get housing, all of these different things that unfortunately a lot of folks on this call, I'm sure, have actually had to do on their own, right? I think that that's where I appreciate Anthony so much, who is down in Fayetteville, Cumberland County, because of all the work he does on his own, right? Trying to support folks who are formerly incarcerated. And so I just really appreciate, I think, everyone who's doing work in this area on this call. And I think it's still an opportunity for us to say, hey, let's use this ARP funds for this particular sort of for reentry support. And let's also talk about how we continue that funding beyond, right, 2026, right? I think that the amount of funding, I think I sort of work on budgets a lot, and I was so surprised at how little funding was going to reentry programs in the state of North Carolina. And some of that really depends on, right, the relationship that legislators have with sort of the state government. One of the students who's working with us this semester too from Winston-Salem State is on. And so she's gonna be working on this project the rest of the semester, really trying to actually ask, like, when do legislators advocate for more funding for their local reentry councils? And I think that that's so important. We just sort of put a question in there too about, like, do they see possibilities for more of this funding coming from ARP funds too, right? So I think Suzy talked a little bit about sort of the individual, local, and city and county sort of funding, but there's still also, right, state funding that we can still put aside for some of this too. So I think it's a really important issue. I'm happy to sort of talk to anybody about these things and how sort of you create local campaigns to keep sort of pressure on these funding pieces. But as many of you said in the chat, this is hard. This is, I think, tracking it down shouldn't be our responsibility, because we should have governments that are responsive to us. But unfortunately, that's often not what we see. And so I'm happy to sort of definitely sort of reach out and talk to anyone who's interested in this, but I will pass it back. I know I also said a lot, so I'll pass it back to you, Quisha.
Thank you, Felicia. And also uplifting from the chat, Anthony Faison saying, thank you, Felicia, for your support. Also want to uplift Libby Fisher, who said, I just emailed the chair, vice chair of my county commission to ask how they are managing the process to decide how these funds are being spent. So go ahead, Libby. We're going to see what's happening. People have been sharing their counties in the chat. And so we know y'all are kind of thinking about what can happen in my local county. You've heard some really great ideas from Felicia around what we're seeing around the state. And so some models that people may be able to use, as well as some resources that are sharing nationally in other parts of the country what's happening. So there are some tools, it seems like, and some ideas that can be available. I do want to uplift a question for the group that came, where was it? Okay, from Judith Van Wyck, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Is there any recommendation coming down from the federal government that this money be used for reentry? And I just want to add to what Judith is asking. Have you heard, where are you seeing the pressure around or push around the ways that this money can be spent? If anyone could kind of offer a quick response to that.
I can just speak from like the folks who we work with like on the national level, and I can drop this in the chat too, the Community Resource Hub. They sort of first put it on our radar because they were seeing that at the federal level, the sort of the Treasury was actually pushing for some of this to go to like hiring new officers and also to overtime pay. And for us, that's like, that shouldn't be the priority given sort of like how COVID has impacted so many of us in different ways, especially because early on in the pandemic too, there's actually like, there was just shifts in sort of local law enforcement in the way they operated. And so it didn't make sense that they should actually be putting more money into this area if actually they weren't on the streets as much. They're actually just giving citations. They're supposed to be trying to sort of decarcerate jails across the state. So it didn't feel right for them to sort of also be pushing at the same time that y'all need to be hiring more officers. So I can drop that in the chat. But that's the one that I think for us was definitely like a red flag of like actually, like we don't think that there should be growth in the carceral system and in the carceral state, especially when folks aren't working, right? When folks are dying because of the pandemic, all of these pieces that felt like this is like a misplaced and misuse of our money too. But I'll drop that in the chat. I'm sure other folks can jump in.
Thank you, Suzy. And also, sorry, thank you, Felicia, reading Suzy's comment. Just to say for folks who are in the chat, you kind of shared things about your counties. Suzy has said, if you want help finding out about the status in your local community, reach out, and provided an email contact for everyone. So we want to kind of move things along. We still have another person on our panel to hear from, and we also want to hear from you. But before we do that, I want to pass it over to Tim for another poll.
Thank you, Quisha. I just launched a new poll. This one is about where the ARPA funds should be prioritized. And so we have anything from reentry / supportive housing, employment and entrepreneurship, training and peer support, healthcare access, or other. And so if you can take a minute or two to answer those polls, we're still getting awesome commentary in the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to go there. But yeah, it's also multiple choice, and so you have so you can select multiple options on this poll on where you would like where you feel these ARPA funds should be prioritized. I'll give another maybe 20 seconds or so to wrap up your answers, and then we can pass it on to Drew Dahl. All right, wrapping up our answers real quick. Getting just under the wire here. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog, I apologize. All right. And so it looks like results, a big majority of answers seem to be reentry and supportive housing, right under that as healthcare access, a lot of talk about training and peer support, and then employment, entrepreneurship, and other community investments. Back to you, Quisha.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thanks y'all for completing this poll. Okay, so our last person we have on the panel this evening is Drew Dahl. And Drew will be able to share an example of a local North Carolina-based effort for reentry funding specific to the city of Durham. So handing it over to you, Drew.
Hey, and it won't take me more than 50 or 60 minutes to do this. So, hey, thank you all for hanging in. I think this is a great discussion we've had so far. So back last fall, City of Durham actually went out and asked for proposals for how to spend ARPA money. What's interesting in the discussions we've had about representation is part of the matrix used to evaluate who they would fund or not. One of the items in there were the people that were most affected part of the decision-making process or part of the process for deciding how you wanted to spend the funds you were asking for. So there is a way, if you're going to go out for requests for proposals, there is a way to make it part of the scoring that the people most affected are going to be included in the process of deciding how to spend the funds. So interestingly enough, from the last survey, when we started putting together the proposal for reentry, we wanted to address housing, we wanted to address employment, we wanted to address training, and we wanted to address health outcomes. So around the table, when we started making the decisions, there was the Criminal Justice Resource Center, which is a county agency in Durham that the local reentry council sits in. Folks from the local reentry council. We had folks from Wounded Healers, which is a peer support organization here in Durham. We had folks from Welcome Home, which is a city program that provides 30 hours of peer support the first 60 to 90 days someone is home from prison. We had folks from FIT. In fact, Durrell, that's on the call with us, was part of the discussions here. And if you don't know FIT, you ought to. It provides health transition for folks coming home from prison. And we thought, and we had some housing providers as well. So the idea we came up with was to do something that would both increase services as well as create employment opportunities for folks who are criminally justice involved. So we decided to staff some peer support positions. We're going to staff a peer support position in the local reentry council with a focus on helping folks navigate the process from going from a transitional home to that next place. And for many folks, I mean, I know when I came home, I really wanted to move from living in a transitional house to living in my own place. But when you've been gone for a while, the process of doing that and knowing, where do I have to go to make my deposits? How do I get stuff turned on? What is the landlord going to expect from me? That all that kind of stuff, you need help, as well as doing some development on where is housing that people can move into. We also are planning to staff a position within Welcome Home because we simply don't have enough peer support for the demand for folks in that first 60 to 90 days home. The next piece of it is a staff person to work with FIT because I know Durrell is constantly overwhelmed with the size of the caseload he has. We could do more if we had another peer support specialist. The good thing is all these positions we're staffing are people that are criminal justice involved. They're folks that have come home from prison, have been through peer support training, and now we're going to employ them at not just a living wage, but a good wage, a career wage. And then the last position, one of the things we find we struggle with in Durham is we have a lot of reentry resources, but folks coming home, we have about 700 people a year come home from prison. Within the local reentry council, Welcome Home, the coalition, we see maybe 250 to 300 of them. We're not touching nearly as many people as we need to. So we want to staff a position to work with community partners and everybody from talking to community corrections, to Alliance Healthcare, to Southlight, to any place that we think someone would bump up against when they come home. To try to get the word out to make sure we're capturing people when they come home and getting them into the reentry process. Well, all that begs the question of how do we get trained peer support specialists? So North Carolina does not have a peer support training specialty that's certified to work with folks coming home from prison. Texas does. So initially, we're going to pay to train folks, and about a dozen a year down in Texas, to go down and do the program down there that is a module that specifically trains about working with folks in reentry. One of the other things we're going to do is we're going to fund the creation of a North Carolina peer support training program that will graduate people with a specialty in peer support for reentry. Let's see. Oh, and part of that training is, there's nothing like actually having to do it. So we're going to create a pool of money to fund on-the-job training, that you finish your peer support training, you're a certified peer support specialist, but you haven't necessarily done peer support. What does it look like to do it every day? And so we're going to create some funding opportunities where we're going to pay for folks to be able to intern with an active peer support specialist, just to kind of learn what is it like to be able to go out in the field and do peer support. Then on the housing side, we're creating a pool of money to really focus on a couple of things. One is housing prices in Durham, probably like much of the rest of North Carolina, have just skyrocketed over the last 4 or 5 years, to the point that we have lost transitional housing because those houses are being sold out from under the transition provider to be, well, gentrification in Northeast Central Durham and in South Side. So what we want to do is create a pool of money to help protect some of the existing transitional housing, and it hopefully expand back to at least where we were, hopefully be able to get some more. But besides just that general transitional housing, there's some specialty housing that for folks that are especially hard to house. So when we look at folks that are on the registry, they're on the sex offender registry, they're extraordinarily difficult to house. It is not at all unusual to have folks come home and there's just no place for them. There's not a bed for them. Unfortunately, in Durham, and probably like in many of your counties, the sheriff will not allow people to register homeless. So they'll give you 3 days. If you do not find an address, they will lock you up for failure to notify of a location. We've got to have a better solution than just saying, well, we don't have room for you. Also, for folks coming home with mental health, substance abuse, or dual diagnosis, we need to do a better job of, rather just having a transition house, have transition houses that are programmatically set up to handle those folks. And then when you finish with transitional housing, where do you go next? We've had some limited success in Durham with some of our housing providers creating that next step housing, that they'll buy duplexes and they'll create housing for folks where, not having a credit history, maybe you've got an eviction back from 5-10 years ago, that's not going to prevent you from being able to get into housing. Maybe you can't save first and last month's rent. We're going to encourage housing providers to create that next step housing, so that folks that we have folks in Durham right now that are in a transition house, have a good job, have a car, but there's no place for them to go because they just can't afford to make that next step. And the affordable housing we do have in Durham is not accessible to people with criminal records. So address housing, address training to train more peer support specialists, employ those peer support specialists we are training, create opportunities for people who are thinking about peer support and have gotten the certification to do on-the-job training, and to create a program within North Carolina that will certify peer support specialists for working in reentry. The feedback we've gotten has been very positive from the city council. The thing that's kind of held us up right now is, as we talked about, this is new. It's never happened before. Durham has, just city of Durham, not counting the county, has $64 million in change to spend. And as a city, we're having a hard time kind of figuring out exactly how to get the money out to people. But yeah, I think we're going to get funded, and hopefully we will have money sometime second half of 2022.
Ooh,
and I'm going to stick
Drew.
my contact info in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Drew. Folks are saying it sounds like an awesome opportunity and good luck. And I'm also wondering, Drew, if you think it may be possible if folks may be willing to share some of those proposals and other materials just as possible ideas for folks thinking about this opportunity in other parts of the state. I'm definitely seeing some organizing happening in this chat. And so I'm really excited about that, and really excited to see people kind of already making moves with how you might want to look at your funds locally. And just want to also uplift Felicia, Andrew, sharing their contact information or ways that you can reach out to them to kind of stay in the loop about, I guess, both what's happening in Durham with what Drew is sharing, and also kind of generally with Felicia with NC SPAN. So I know it's after the hour, and there may be some folks who need to hop off. Drew, go ahead. I see you.
I just wanted to answer the question about the Excel program in Durham. No ARPA money funded that. That actually came from Jack Dorsey at Twitter.
Thank you so much for that, Drew. Yeah, we have some folks kind of sharing contact information in the chat, and we can make a point of trying to consolidate that and share it in our feedback email. Also, we wanted to let folks know that we are doing a survey that's just going to ask you what county you're in, kind of what level of involvement you have had in any of this ARPA work, and kind of how you're engaged in reentry, and kind of what you're seeing and hoping for locally. And we'd love to stay in touch with you as well as you think about kind of go on your journeys to try to get local funding. And so just wanted to, for folks who are able to stay on, just wanted to see if there are any other examples of ARPA funding efforts or ideas that people are seeing in your local area that you'd like to share. Please feel free to raise your hand or put that information in the chat. And also, Tim has shared the link to the survey in the chat, as well as Libby sharing contact information in the chat too. So anyone have an experience ARPA funding or are kind of pushing for ARPA funding locally, or also just like reentry program idea that you want to uplift, and we can give you an opportunity to share.
Yeah, so just like Quisha mentioned, you just need to click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom call, and we'll be able to call on you if you would like to, again, talk about any ARPA efforts you are, or ideas or funding efforts you can think of. And we might start treating it like school. If no one raises their hand, we might start calling on people. Just kidding. We won't do that to you. We'll start seeing our attendees drop like flies immediately.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I will say the people I would have called on like school are not on the call right now, so they just missed it. But I'll go ahead. Please feel free if there's something that comes to you and want to share in the chat. Please feel free to use the chat to share. And then just if there are any additional questions, any insights, anything anyone else wants to share before we wrap up, please let us know. Or please, you can also use the raise hand to share or enter in the chat any questions. Seeing some great comments from folks. Libby Fisher saying, thanks for this, outstanding. I've got to run, but so worthwhile to sit in on this informative session. From Laura Holland, this was super informative. Darrell Clayton shared some contact information. As mentioned earlier, Darrell is with NC Fit. Let's see. Okay. Okay, great. Well, just want to again thank you all for joining. I hope that there was something in all of this that was exciting to you, that was interesting to you. I also want to say, I know this is a lot of information. So please, take your time, work through the resources that we've shared. We have folks here. I think everyone here has provided some contact information for you. If you're interested in following up and learning more about what this might look like in your local city or county, we want to see these funds go towards reentry for sure. So we're really excited to think of ways that you might be able to push forward on your efforts, and excited to see what people are already working on just from being in this call. So again, there's a survey link that will come back out to you at the end, and then a brief survey right when you exit, just to say if you're interested in staying in the loop for what we're doing with the Fair Chance Criminal Justice Team. Just want to turn it over in case anyone on the panel has any kind of last nuggets for us.
I don't think I have anything additional. It looks like folks are already like, I'm going to contact city council, county commissioners, and that's it. Yeah. So I think Suzy and I are available. All of us are available to like track that information down too, if it feels like you can't find it, but that's probably all of it. Yeah. I mean, email those folks, call those folks, show up to meetings. That's probably the only ongoing advice.
Okay. And also, okay, Dr. Julius Mallette, who's my dad, full disclosure, is in the chat with a question. And I don't know if anyone has an answer for this, but I did see someone else earlier talking a little bit about some of the opioid settlement funds. And so there may be some interesting intersections here. But the question is, what are the best strategies for collaborating with existing programs with opium use disorder therapy and reentry? So this may be helpful for some of the folks that have also shared their information on the chat, but just wanted to see if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I would suggest if you have FIT in your county, coordinating with them, because FIT is the clearinghouse. I'm sorry, formerly incarcerated transition, but it's it sits generally the community, their peer support specialists who generally sit in community health and provide services for everything from diabetes, heart disease, mental health, and certainly would be a place to start with coordinating services.
And seeing that echoed in the chat too. And I'm also, even though I think you are in Pitt County, I'm gonna share still Darrell Clayton's information because he may be able to point you in the right direction as well. Oh, and also from Laura Holland, who's our project director, the list of the allocations from the opioid settlement in North Carolina. So however, that may also be useful. Okay.
We have a raised hand from Jessica, so I'll pop her in real quick.
Hi, guys. I'm Sarah Jessica Farber. I currently work for the MAN at the Attorney General's office, but working with justice-involved people is my my heart and my roots. If you go to ncopioidsettlement.org, that's the dashboard that will let you see like where each county or town or city, you'll be able to see how much money they're getting over the 18 years. And you'll also be able to look at all the types of programs that opioid funds are allowed to be used for. It's everything from supportive housing to like driving people to treatment, to funding medically assisted treatment, to syringe exchange programs. Like, it's a really impressive list, I think, as someone who has pretty low expectations for the government being involved in this. Telling on myself, so check that out. There's also 2 email addresses at the bottom there of that webpage, one to contact DOJ with questions and one to contact DHHS. I would say if there's a program like in your area, like that you want to support, get with that person whoever handles funding requests in their office and contact your like whether it's a city or town or county where you are, and work with DHS to start jumping the hoops to get that money. I mean, it's going to have a lot of red tape. That's just the way it's going to be. But guys, it's like over $700 million over 18 years. It's so much money. Hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. And let's help them help themselves by showing them ways that they can spend this money. I know the folks who have been on this call have a lot of ideas and insights about how that can best be done. Okay, so just wrapping us up again, thank y'all again so much for your time. The link to the live stream will be available on Facebook, and the link and so many of these resources that have been shared will be made available to everyone who registered for this call. Just so much gratitude that we're seeing in the chat for folks. Thank you all to all of our panelists for joining, Tim for helping us with our polls, and everyone who shared insights tonight and just showed up. So we really appreciate you. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and yeah, stay in touch with us. Let us know how you can support. And I guess I can also share my contact information in the chat as well, in case people are interested in chatting with me a little bit too. Okay, thank y'all so much. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.